It was just another quiet morning, the kind I'd always cherished. The sun was slipping through the kitchen curtains, the smell of fresh toast filling the air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. I sat across the table from my daughter, the little girl I once held in my arms, and her husband, the man she had chosen to build her life with. We laughed lightly about the weather, shared stories from the past week, and for a fleeting while, I believed we were a family, together, safe and happy. I remember smiling at her, my heart swelling with love and trust, because as a mother, all I've ever wanted was to see her safe, to see her cared for, to see her loved. But as I buttered my toast and reached for my cup of coffee, I noticed her eyes shift, cold, determined, almost nervous. She looked at me differently, as though she was preparing for something. That's when she said it. "Mom, I have a surprise for you." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what was coming. No warning of the storm about to break in that very room. What she handed me across the table that morning would shatter the illusion of family, turn love into betrayal, and leave me facing a choice I never thought I'd make. And within just 1 hour, what began as an ordinary breakfast would end with the police knocking at my door. The morning had been so ordinary, so deceptively ordinary, the kind of morning where you think life is steady, safe, and predictable. I remember the way the sunlight spread across the kitchen table, spilling golden light over the plates of eggs and buttered toast. I remember the soft clink of spoons against coffee cups, the hum of the refrigerator, and the way my daughter's laughter filled the room, making me forget every worry, every sleepless night I'd ever endured. That's what motherhood does. You lose yourself in those little moments of peace, thinking maybe, just maybe, everything will finally be okay. But life has a cruel way of twisting the knife when you least expect it. I was sipping my coffee, warm and sweet, when my daughter put her fork down and looked at me with a strange glimmer in her eyes. It wasn't joy, not really, though she tried to disguise it as excitement. No, it was something colder, sharper, like the glint of glass in the sun. "Mom," she said, her voice soft, almost playful. "I have a surprise for you." My heart skipped, just as it always did when she used to say those words as a little girl. Back then, her surprises were pictures drawn in crayon, handmade cards with hearts and flowers, little bundles of wildflowers she picked from the yard. My mind leapt to those memories, and for a moment, I smiled, expecting something sweet, something innocent. But then she reached down into her purse, and the sound of rustling paper filled the air. Slowly, carefully, she slid an envelope across the table toward me. It was thick, sealed, and cold against the wood when it stopped in front of my plate. I looked at her puzzled, a faint nervousness creeping into my chest. "What's this?" I asked, my fingers brushing the corner of the envelope. "Just open it, Mom," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. So I did. I tore the flap open gently, almost afraid of what I might find inside. And then I saw it. Papers. Stacks of them. Pages filled with numbers, signatures, dates, and one figure. One figure that seemed to leap off the page like a slap to the face. $400,000. My heart stopped. I read it again, certain I had misunderstood, but the ink didn't lie. It was a statement of debt. $400,000. Before I could even process it, her husband leaned forward, his voice sharp and cold, cutting through the room like a blade. "It must be paid by Monday." I blinked, stunned, certain I had misheard. "Excuse me?" I whispered. "You heard me," he said firmly, folding his arms across his chest. $400,000. That's what I owe, and it has to be cleared by Monday. I stared at him in disbelief, my stomach sinking into a pit of dread. My hands trembled as I held the papers, my eyes scanning the bold numbers again and again, hoping they would somehow change, that they would shrink into something reasonable, something possible. But they didn't. I looked up at my daughter, searching her face for an explanation, for a joke, for anything that would tell me this was some kind of mistake. "Sweetheart," I said, my voice cracking, This can't be real. What is this?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands calmly in her lap, as if she had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "It's very real, Mom," she said gently, almost sweetly. "And you're the only one who can help." My breath caught in my throat. The only one who can help. $400,000. I shook my head in disbelief. "I don't have that kind of money. I can't—" But before I could finish, her husband cut me off, his tone turning colder, harsher. "You can. Don't pretend you can't. We know you've got savings. You own the house. You've got insurance, retirement. You'll figure it out." His words landed like blows, and I sat frozen, clutching the papers as though they might explain themselves if I just stared long enough. Then my daughter reached across the table, her eyes pleading, but not with love. No, it was manipulation, pure and deliberate. "Mom," she said softly, "you've always told me family comes first. You always said we take care of each other. Well, this is your chance to prove it." Her words cut deeper than any knife. I could feel the guilt she tried to pour into me, the weight of obligation, the unspoken accusation that if I didn't do this, I would be betraying my role as a mother. But something inside me hardened. I closed the envelope slowly, my hands steadying themselves as I placed it back on the table. "I have always put family first," I said quietly. "I raised you, I worked, I sacrificed, I gave you everything I had, and more. But this?" I shook my head. "This isn't family, this is exploitation." Her smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Mom," she said, her tone sharper now, her voice trembling with frustration. "We're not asking for a favor, we're telling you what needs to be done. If you love me, if you care about me at all, you'll do this. Don't make me feel like you don't care." My chest tightened, but I refused to let the guilt take hold. "I do love you," I whispered, "more than anything in this world. But love doesn't mean I take on your husband's mistakes. Love doesn't mean I bankrupt myself for a debt that isn't mine." Her husband leaned forward again, his face hardening, his voice low and menacing. "You'll regret this," he said flatly. "If you don't pay, things will get very ugly for you. Very fast." I stared at him, my heart pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "No," I said firmly. "If things get ugly, that's because of the choices you've made, not mine." For a moment, the room was silent. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of fury. Her lips trembled as she tried one last time. "Please, Mom," she whispered, her voice quivering. "If you don't do this, if you don't save us, what will happen to me?" And that's when I realized. This wasn't about family. This wasn't about love. This was about using me, draining me, manipulating me until there was nothing left. I drew in a slow breath and shook my head. "I'm sorry," I said softly, but firmly. "I won't do it." Her face darkened instantly, her husband slamming his hand against the table in anger, the plates rattling as the illusion of our peaceful breakfast shattered completely. And in that moment, I knew. I had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The silence after I refused hung heavy in the air, thicker than smoke. My daughter sat frozen, staring at me with wide, burning eyes, her lips trembling with rage. Her husband leaned back in his chair, smirking, as though he'd been waiting for this exact moment, for me to say no, so he could unleash whatever venom he'd been keeping bottled inside. But before I could even breathe, before I could even take a sip of water to calm the dryness in my throat, it happened. The sound of porcelain scraping against wood broke the silence. My daughter's hands were shaking, her face twisted in fury, her eyes wet with angry tears. And then, in one violent motion, she grabbed her coffee cup, the steam still rising from its surface, and hurled it at me. The scalding liquid splashed across my chest, my hands, my face. I gasped, the sting immediate, sharp, and searing. The world seemed to slow in that instant. The clatter of the cup hitting the floor, the smell of bitter coffee flooding the air, the hiss of liquid dripping down my clothes. But the real pain wasn't on my skin. No. The real pain cut far deeper than any burn ever could. It was the pain of betrayal. I looked at her, my own flesh and blood, the little girl I had rocked to sleep, kissed goodnight, and carried in my arms through fevers and storms. I looked at her, and all I could see was a stranger, someone who could look into my eyes and throw boiling coffee without hesitation, without mercy. "Get out of my house," her husband bellowed, his voice shaking the walls. He stood towering over me, pointing toward the door as though I were some intruder, some beggar who had wandered into their space uninvited. His face was red with fury, his fists clenched, his body tense with rage. "Get out!" he shouted again. Louder this time, his spit flying, his eyes full of hatred. And my daughter didn't stop him. She didn't step in to protect me. She didn't rush to help me as I wiped the hot coffee from my burning skin. She didn't whisper, "I'm sorry." No, she just sat there, her chest heaving, her eyes like daggers, as though I had become her enemy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out to ask her how she could do this to me. But the words died in my throat. Instead, I felt something heavier, something I couldn't put into words. It wasn't just anger or sorrow or disbelief. It was the crushing weight of knowing that the child I had loved, nurtured, and sacrificed for could look at me with nothing but contempt. Do you know what it feels like? To give your whole life to someone only to be treated as disposable? To be called a burden, an inconvenience, an obstacle to their comfort? That is a pain that no burn, no bruise, no wound could ever match. I thought of the nights I stayed awake by her bedside when she was sick, holding her tiny hand in mine. I thought of the mornings I went to work with no sleep, just to make sure she had food on the table and shoes on her feet. I thought of the years I sacrificed my own dreams, my own needs, just so she could chase hers. And now, in return, she gave me coffee burns and silence. I took a deep, shuddering breath, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Slowly, I pushed back my chair. My legs trembled beneath me, not just from the sting of the burn, but from the weight of heartbreak. I stood tall, adjusting my jacket, brushing the wet fabric from my chest. Her husband sneered, stepping closer. "Did you not hear me? I said get out. You're not wanted here, not now, not ever." I looked at him for a moment, my jaw tight, my hands trembling at my sides. And then I turned my gaze to my daughter. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just stared down at the table, her face twisted in stubborn pride, as though she couldn't admit what she had just done, as though acknowledging it would make her face the monster she had become. In that silence, I understood something clearly. She wasn't going to stop him. She wasn't going to choose me. She had already chosen him, chosen his debt, his lies, his cruelty, over her own mother. And so, I did the only thing I could do. I gathered the last pieces of my dignity, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the door. My steps were steady, my head held high, though every fiber of my being screamed with pain. Behind me, I heard her voice break the silence one last time. "Don't come back unless you're ready to help us," she snapped, her tone bitter, unrecognizable. I paused at the doorway, my hand resting on the cool metal of the knob. For a moment, I considered turning back, saying something, anything. But what words could possibly matter now? None. So instead, I whispered softly, to myself more than to them, I have helped, I have given everything, and one day, you'll understand what you've lost. Then I opened the door. The cold morning air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the burning sting of the coffee still clinging to my skin. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a quiet click. And just like that, I left. No shouting, no screaming, no dramatic fight, just silence. But inside that silence was every tear I refused to shed in front of them, every scream I swallowed, every ounce of love I had poured into a daughter who no longer saw me as her mother. As I walked down the street, my vision blurred. The tears I had held back finally slid down my cheeks, hot and bitter. My chest ached, my heart cracked open, but still, I walked, because sometimes dignity is the only thing you have left. And I wasn't about to let them take that from me too. The door closed softly behind me, but in my heart, it slammed. That single click of the latch seemed to echo louder than all the shouting, all the accusations, all the venom I had just endured inside. I stood there for a moment on their porch, frozen, the morning air cool against my face, the sting of scalding coffee still burning against my skin. My legs felt heavy, like stone, but I forced myself to move. Step by step, I walked away, each footfall carrying me further from the house that once held laughter, warmth, and love. A house where I thought I was welcome, a house where I believed I was family. Now it felt like nothing but a prison of betrayal. As I walked, the world around me seemed eerily normal. Cars passed by, neighbors watered their lawns, children laughed somewhere in the distance. And yet, inside me, a storm was raging. My heart pounded, my chest ached, and my mind spun in circles, trying to comprehend what had just happened. How had we gotten here? How had I gone from being the woman who gave my daughter life, who sacrificed everything to see her smile, to being the target of her rage, the one she burned, the one she threw out like garbage? I took a deep breath, but it caught in my throat. And so, as I walked, memories began to pour over me. I remembered the night I held her for the first time, tiny and fragile, her little fingers curling around mine. In that moment, I promised her silently that I would protect her, love her, and give her the best life I possibly could. That promise became my reason for living. I remembered the sleepless nights, the nights when she cried from fevers, when I sat by her bed with a cool cloth on her forehead, whispering lullabies until her breathing calmed. I remembered the way she clung to me in thunderstorms, burying her face against my chest, trusting that as long as I held her, the world couldn't hurt her. I remembered the sacrifices too. The jobs I worked long past exhaustion, the meals I skipped so she could eat, the dreams I put aside, the education I never finished, the promotions I turned down, all because I wanted to be there for her, to give her every opportunity I never had. And I remembered her smile. That little girl's smile was enough to make all the pain disappear. It was my reward, my treasure, my light in the darkest times. So how had that little girl grown into a woman who could look me in the eye and throw hot coffee at me? How had she become someone who saw me not as her mother, but as her last option for bailing out her husband's mistakes? My chest tightened, and tears stung my eyes. But I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not here, not out in the open where strangers might see. I kept walking. Each step was heavy with memories. I thought of the birthday parties I scraped together when money was tight, just to see her blow out candles and make wishes. I thought of the nights I stayed up sewing her costumes for school plays because we couldn't afford store-bought ones. I thought of the countless times I sat in the front row of her recitals, clapping louder than anyone else, my heart swelling with pride. I thought of the first time she told me she loved someone, how her eyes sparkled when she described the man who would later become her husband. She said he was kind, that he made her feel safe. I wanted to believe her. I wanted her to have the love she deserved. And so, even when I had doubts, even when I saw cracks in his character, I stayed silent because I wanted her to be happy. And this was how it ended. Her husband screaming at me to get out, her hand hurling coffee into my face, her silence, her refusal to defend me, to even look at me as I walked away. The betrayal cut so deep I could barely breathe. I reached the corner of the street and paused, resting my hand on a lamppost as if it could hold me up when my own legs threatened to give out. I asked myself the questions every parent dreads. Where did I go wrong? Was I too soft? Too giving? Did I love her so much that I blinded her to the meaning of love itself? Did my sacrifices teach her gratitude? Or did they teach her entitlement? I wanted answers, but the wind gave me none. The world around me kept moving, indifferent to the storm tearing through my chest. And still, I walked. I thought about the word mother, what it meant, what it had always meant to me. To be a mother was to give without expecting anything in return, to love unconditionally, to endure heartache, disappointment, even disrespect, because the bond of blood outweighed it all. But in that moment, I wondered, had I been wrong all along? Because motherhood felt like a contract no one else had signed. I had given and given and given, but when it was my turn to need even an ounce of love, an ounce of respect, what did I receive? Hot coffee, shouts, and a door slammed behind me. As I walked, I finally let the tears come. They blurred my vision, streaked my face, and fell onto the pavement below. I didn't sob. I didn't break down in the middle of the street. No, I cried silently, my grief tucked into the corners of my heart where no one could see the depth of my devastation. But the tears carried my truth. The truth that I had loved with every fiber of my being and still been cast aside like nothing. I remembered the words she had said, sharp as glass. Don't come back unless you're ready to help us. Help us. As though my only value was in what I could give. As though my worth was measured in dollars, not love. I clenched my fists, wiping my face with the back of my sleeve. No, I would not let them reduce me to a bank account. I would not let them strip me of my dignity, of my identity, of the truth of who I am. I am a mother. I am a woman. I am a human being. And I deserve more than this. The farther I walked, the lighter I felt. Not because the pain lessened, but because I knew I had chosen the harder road. I had chosen to stand firm, to refuse their demands, to hold on to what little self-respect I still had left. I reached my own street at last, the familiar sight of my small home bringing me a fragile comfort. I opened the door, stepped inside, and let the silence wash over me. No shouts, no accusations, no manipulation, just silence. I leaned against the door, closed my eyes, and exhaled. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I could begin to heal, that I could sit in my quiet home and slowly stitch my broken heart back together. But I was wrong, because an hour later, there was a knock at my door, and everything I thought I knew about betrayal was about to change. An hour passed in silence after I returned home. I had slipped out of my stained clothes, washed the scalding coffee from my skin, and sat at my kitchen table staring at the empty wall. My hands trembled as I held a damp towel to my chest. Not from the burns. They hurt, yes, but I could handle pain. What shook me was the betrayal. The silence in my house felt heavy, but safe. For a moment, I believed the worst was behind me. I thought I could finally breathe, lick my wounds, and try to put the morning behind me. But then, a knock. It was sharp, firm, unmistakable. I froze. The sound of it sliced through the quiet like a blade. I hesitated, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. Slowly, I rose from my chair, my knees weak, and walked toward the door. When I opened it, 2 uniformed officers stood on my porch. Their expressions were stern, unreadable. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we need to speak with you. There's been..." An incident. An incident. The word sent a chill down my spine. What kind of incident? I asked, clutching the edge of the doorframe for balance. The officer glanced at his notepad. We've received a report that you assaulted your daughter and her husband earlier this morning. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Assault? For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened. My chest burned hotter than the coffee that had been thrown at me. What? I stammered. That's not true. That's not what happened at all. Ma'am? The other officer said gently. We'll need you to answer some questions. May we come inside? I stepped aside slowly, my mind spinning, my heart hammering against my ribs. They entered, their boots heavy against the floor, their radios crackling faintly at their sides. One of them sat at the table where I had just been gathering myself, while the others stood near the door, watchful. Please, I said, my voice trembling. Sit. I'll tell you everything. The officer flipped open his notebook. Let's start from the beginning. Were you at your daughter's home this morning? Yes, I admitted, my hands twisting together nervously. I was there for breakfast, but I didn't assault anyone. According to their statement, the officer continued, you became violent after a disagreement about money. They claim you threw a hot drink at your daughter and then tried to strike her husband. I felt my jaw drop. My legs nearly gave out from under me. They said I threw the coffee? I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. No, that's not true. That's not true at all. It was my daughter who threw the coffee. At me. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them wrote something down. Do you have any injuries? The first officer asked. I pulled my sleeve back, revealing the reddened skin on my forearm where the hot liquid had splashed. I pointed to the faint redness on my neck, the lingering sting on my chest. This is what she did to me, I said softly. I didn't touch her. I didn't touch him. I just walked away. The officer leaned forward, studying the burns carefully. He nodded once, his eyes softening just slightly. Can anyone verify your account of what happened? He asked. For a moment, my heart sank. I had left quietly. No one had followed me. No one had spoken up for me inside that house. I had thought I was completely alone. But then I remembered. The neighbor, across the street, old Mrs. Henderson had been watering her flowers that morning when I left. I remembered her gaze lingering on me, concerned as I walked down the path with coffee stains dripping from my blouse. And there was also the cafe owner. My daughter and her husband had stopped at the cafe just before breakfast. They had argued with the barista, loudly, about their bill. Surely someone there had overheard something about their financial troubles. Yes, I said suddenly. My neighbor. She saw me leave. She saw the coffee stains. She can tell you I wasn't the aggressor. And the staff at the cafe, they know about his debts. They've seen how he behaves. The officer jotted it down. We'll look into that. The questioning went on. They asked me about my relationship with my daughter, about whether there had been past arguments, about whether I had ever threatened them. Each time I answered calmly, honestly, though inside I was breaking. Because do you know what it feels like? To have the child you raised, the child you sacrificed everything for, accuse you of violence? To twist the truth so cruelly that strangers show up at your door ready to believe the worst about you? It's a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. Because I knew the truth was on my side. And then, the evidence began to speak for itself. The officers stepped outside to call the neighbor. Minutes later, they returned, their expressions changed. She confirmed your story, one of them said. She saw you leaving their home. She described your clothes, the stains, the way you held yourself. She said you looked hurt, not aggressive. Relief washed over me, but it was only the beginning. The cafe staff had also spoken up. They confirmed that my daughter and her husband had been there that morning, that they had caused a scene, that the husband had been ranting about money, debt, and family obligations. The barista even mentioned overhearing him say something about making me pay up. The officer's tone shifted. What began as suspicion turned into something else. Understanding, maybe even sympathy. "Ma'am," the officer said gently, closing his notebook, "thank you for your time. We'll be conducting a full investigation, but from what we've gathered so far, it doesn't look like you were the aggressor here." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. One of them stood, adjusting his hat. "We'll be having a conversation with your daughter and her husband. It's possible they may face charges for filing a false report. And if your injuries worsen, please seek medical attention. Document everything." I followed them to the door, my legs still trembling, my hands still weak. They stepped out onto the porch, their boots crunching against the gravel. As they left, I stood in the doorway, clutching the frame, staring out at the empty street. For the first time that day, I felt a flicker of justice, a flicker of truth breaking through the lies. But even with that flicker, my heart still ached, because no amount of police reports or legal consequences could erase what had already been done. My daughter had turned against me, and the scar of that betrayal would last longer than any burn. Still, in the smallest corner of my heart, I felt the tide beginning to turn. They had tried to paint me as the villain, but the truth, slowly, steadily, was beginning to unfold. The hours after the officers left felt endless. I sat in silence, staring at the faint burns on my arm, at the coffee stains still clinging to my blouse where the fabric refused to come clean. My house felt cold despite the warm sun outside. Cold and empty. I kept asking myself the same question. How could she? How could my daughter, the baby I nursed, the child I read bedtime stories to, the girl I worked 2 jobs to feed and clothe, twist reality into such a monstrous lie? I thought the betrayal of coffee being thrown at me was enough to break me, but knowing she and her husband had called the police, fabricating a story to have me arrested, that was a wound much deeper than flesh. But then, the phone rang. It was one of the officers. His voice was calm, professional, but there was a subtle weight in his tone. "Ma'am," he said, "we've spoken at length with your daughter and her husband. Things are unraveling. We wanted to update you." Unraveling. The word clung to me. I leaned forward in my chair, gripping the receiver as if my life depended on it. He explained that during their questioning, cracks in my daughter's story began to appear. She contradicted herself more than once. Her husband grew defensive, angry, almost reckless with his words. When pressed about the debt, he slipped, mentioning names, shady business partners, money that had nothing to do with simple loans. And then it came spilling out. The so-called debt of $400,000 wasn't just poor financial planning. It wasn't medical bills or student loans or anything remotely sympathetic. No, it was tied to illegal investments, gambling debts, and money owed to dangerous people. People who had already begun circling. The husband had been cornered, desperate. And my daughter had been complicit all along. The plan, it turned out, was simple. Manipulate me into paying off his debt by any means necessary. If I refused, they would break me another way. Call the police. Accuse me. Ruin my reputation. Destroy my peace. They wanted to shift the weight of their sins onto my shoulders, but the truth, as it always does, began to crack their scheme wide open. The officer told me they had pulled surveillance footage from the cafe that morning. Cameras had caught the argument between my daughter and her husband. They saw the anger, the desperation in his body language. They saw the way she hissed at him when he complained about money. And later when she threw her cup down in frustration, splashing liquid dangerously close to another customer. It painted a clear picture. Not of me. Of them. My daughter, the little girl I had raised, had stood beside her husband as he dragged her into his mess. And rather than come clean, rather than take responsibility, she chose betrayal. She chose to sacrifice me. I pressed the receiver tighter to my ear as the officer's voice softened. "Ma'am," he said, "it looks like your daughter and her husband may be facing charges. False reporting, possibly fraud. We're still digging, but one thing's for certain. You are not under investigation. You are not at fault." Relief washed over me, but it was not a triumphant relief. It was hollow, empty, because in that moment, I realized vindication doesn't erase heartbreak. I thanked him, my voice barely more than a whisper. After we hung up, I sat in the dim glow of my kitchen, staring out the window at the fading light. And I thought about everything. I thought about the years I worked myself to the bone, sewing torn shoes, skipping meals, taking extra shifts just so she could have the things I never did. I thought about birthday parties I scraped together with nickels and dimes, about the prom dress I stayed up all night hemming, about college tuition payments I somehow managed, even when my own bills stacked higher than I could handle. Every sacrifice, every tear, every sleepless night. And for what? For her to stand in front of strangers and call me a criminal? For her to throw hot coffee at me and then call the police to finish the job? I pressed my palm to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. It was not just grief. It was fury, sharp and unrelenting, though not the kind that makes you reckless. No, this fury became something else inside me, something stronger. They had wanted to destroy me, but they destroyed themselves. Because the truth had unfolded like a blade through silk, cutting their lies apart in front of everyone. And I didn't have to lift a finger. The next day, the officers returned with more updates. The husband's financial dealings had come under scrutiny. His name appeared in records tied to illegal betting operations. There were whispers of loan sharks, forged documents, and even unpaid taxes. My daughter, though not directly tied to every shady detail, was complicit in the scheme. She had signed papers. She had helped hide transactions. She had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. I listened quietly, as the officers explained, nodding as though I were only half there. Inside, I felt torn in two. A mother's heartbreak, and a woman's grim satisfaction. Because isn't it ironic? They had tried to paint me as a villain, to chain me with lies, to make me pay for sins that weren't mine. But instead, they revealed themselves. The betrayal that was supposed to bury me became the shovel that dug their own grave. And though I mourned the daughter I thought I had, I could not ignore the truth. The woman she had become was a stranger who nearly cost me everything. So I stood tall. I spoke clearly. I told the truth every chance I was asked. I carried myself with the dignity they had tried to strip away. And with each passing day, as the investigation unfolded, I felt my strength return. I had been cast out of their home, humiliated, accused. But in the end, it wasn't me standing in the shadow of the law. It was them. And as I sit here telling you my story, I want you to hear this clearly. They wanted to ruin me, but instead they ruined themselves. They wanted to break me, but they built my strength instead. They wanted me to pay for their mistakes, but the only debt that got paid was theirs. And the price was everything. In the end, I realized something. Revenge doesn't always come from shouting or fighting or lashing back. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge. My daughter and her husband expected me to scream, to beg, to crumble under the weight of their lies. But I didn't. I let the truth speak for me. And it did. They faced the consequences of their own choices. They exposed themselves. And me? I walked away with my dignity intact. The burns on my arm have faded now, but the scars inside, they remind me of something more important. That peace is stronger than chaos. That strength doesn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it looks like refusing to let betrayal define who you are. I mourned the family I thought I had. I mourned the little girl I once raised. But I will not carry their lies with me. Because at the end of it all, family isn't just about blood. Family is about trust and strength. Strength is about knowing when to stand firm, when to walk away, and when to let silence be the answer. And that is my peace.